Haley felt her heart race as she handed over her last savings to the ragged stranger. She was hoping she was doing the right thing, but when he vanished into the crowd without a word, doubt and fear gripped her. Was this the mistake that would cost her family everything?
Hi everyone. You're watching True Tales Authentic Emotions. I'm Emma Blake, thrilled to share another gripping story with you. Enjoy.
Haley felt her heart race as she handed over her last savings to the ragged stranger. This was everything she had managed to save for months, meant to cover the rent and groceries for her struggling family. The stranger, a man wrapped in tattered clothes, looked at her with hollow eyes. As she extended her hand, she hoped she was doing the right thing. Haley's thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and hope. She had always believed in helping those in need, but this time, the stakes were incredibly high. The man took the money silently, his hands trembling slightly, and without a word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. A wave of fear washed over her as she realized the gravity of what she had done. As the stranger vanished, doubt and fear gripped Haley's heart. She stood there, frozen, questioning if her compassion had led her to make a terrible mistake. Her mind raced with the possible repercussions. Would her family be able to stay in their home? Had she just doomed them all with her impulsive act of kindness? Haley had grown accustomed to waking up before dawn, her small apartment filled with the soft sounds of her siblings still sleeping. The responsibility of taking care of her family rested squarely on her shoulders. Every morning, she would quietly prepare breakfast, her movements careful not to wake her father, whose health was rapidly declining. The kitchen was modest, with old appliances and worn-out counters, but Haley's determination to provide for her family was unwavering. Haley's day was a relentless cycle of work. After ensuring her siblings were ready for school, she would head out to her small food stand, where she spent hours selling lunches to passers-by. The stand was old, with faded paint and a creaky umbrella, but it was her only means of earning money. Each sale was a small victory, a step closer to paying the rent, yet the anxiety of whether she'd make enough by the end of the month never left her. As the sun set, Haley's work was far from over. After closing her stand, she would rush back home to help her siblings with their homework and take care of the household chores. Her father, once a strong figure in her life, was now too weak to contribute, leaving Haley to shoulder the burden alone. The weight of her responsibilities was crushing, but she never let her siblings see how tired she truly was. Haley knew she had to act fast. The rent was due in a few days, and the money she had given away was gone for good. She couldn't bear the thought of her family being thrown out onto the streets, so she started working extra hours at her food stand, hoping that the longer hours would make up for the lost money. But as the days passed, she realized that even with her best efforts, the return was barely enough to cover basic needs, let alone the rent. Desperation began to creep in as Haley tried to think of other ways to earn money. She considered selling some of their belongings, but they already lived with so little. She asked around the neighborhood, looking for any odd jobs she could take on, but no one had work to offer. The fear of failing her family loomed over her like a dark cloud, growing heavier with each passing day. Despite her tireless efforts, the numbers just didn't add up. Haley found herself staring at her meager earnings, realizing that no matter how hard she worked, it would never be enough. The reality of their situation hit her hard, and for the first time, she felt the sting of hopelessness. But even in that moment, she knew she couldn't give up. There had to be another way. She just hadn't found it yet. Haley was caught off guard when the loud knock echoed through her small apartment. Her heart sank as she opened the door to find Mr. Walter Reed, the stern landlord, standing with a clipboard in hand and an impatient look on his face. She knew why he was there. The rent was overdue, and there was no more time left. Walter's cold eyes scanned the room briefly before settling back on Haley, who was trying her best to maintain composure. The reality of the situation was like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Walter Reed's voice was firm as he reminded Haley of the overdue rent and the consequences of not paying it. Each word felt like a hammer, driving the fear deeper into her heart. The threat of eviction was no longer just a distant worry. It was now a looming reality. Haley felt the pressure building, her thoughts racing to find a solution, but she was out of options. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the tension mounted. She was running out of time, and the risk of losing everything was more real than ever. The whispers started small, just a few neighbors exchanging concerned looks as Haley walked by. But soon, the murmurs turned into outright criticism. How could she be so foolish? They would say, as Haley passed by with her head lowered. Her decision to give away the money became the talk of the neighborhood. People she once considered friends now kept their distance, and the weight of their judgment hung over her like a storm cloud. Each day, the pressure grew, and Haley could feel it chipping away at her already fragile sense of stability. The stress of the situation began to take a toll on Haley's health. Sleepless nights turned into exhaustion, and the constant worry started to show on her face. She would find herself in the middle of a task, her mind drifting to the overwhelming burden she carried. The critical words from her neighbors echoed in her ears, compounding the pressure she already felt. Haley's once vibrant spirit was now dimmed by the relentless fear of what would happen if she couldn't find a way out of this mess. Haley's day started like any other, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. Despite her efforts to push through her exhaustion and work harder, her food stand had fewer customers than usual. The lunches she prepared with care sat untouched, and by the end of the day, she realized she had barely made enough to cover her costs. The failure hit her hard, as every penny mattered, and she knew that losing even a small amount of money could mean the difference between keeping or losing their home. Desperate and out of options, Haley made the painful decision to sell some of their personal belongings. She sifted through the few possessions they had, trying to determine what could fetch enough money to make a difference. The decision to part with these items was agonizing, as each held sentimental value, representing the life they once had before everything became so difficult. The sense of loss deepened, not just financially, but emotionally, as she let go of the remnants of a better past. The tension in Haley's life reached a breaking point when Mr. Walter Reed paid another visit, this time with an ultimatum. Standing at the entrance of their small apartment, Walter's voice was colder than before, and his words cut through the air like a knife. He made it clear that if the rent wasn't paid in full by the end of the week, Haley and her family would be out on the street. The threat of eviction was now more real than ever, and Haley's heart pounded with fear and frustration. She felt cornered, with no clear way out. As the week progressed, the tension between Haley and Walter escalated. Each interaction became more charged, with Walter growing increasingly impatient and Haley struggling to keep her composure. The stress was palpable, and the once distant fear of losing their home had become a suffocating reality. Haley knew she was running out of time, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted, pushing her closer to the edge. The antagonistic relationship with Walter was now a constant source of anxiety, leaving Haley feeling more isolated and desperate than ever. As Haley sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the weight of her decision began to crush her spirit. The doubt that had been lingering in the back of her mind now surged forward, overwhelming her thoughts. She couldn't stop wondering if she had made a terrible mistake by giving her savings to Leo. What if he wasn't who she thought he was? What if her act of kindness had only brought disaster upon her family? These questions gnawed at her, making her second-guess everything she had done. The internal conflict was relentless, and Haley felt herself slipping into despair. The more Haley thought about it, the more her fears seemed justified. Her inner voice grew louder, filled with accusations and regret. She replayed the moment in her mind, wishing she could take it back, but knowing it was too late. The fear of having doomed her family with her impulsive generosity was almost too much to bear. Haley's heart ached as she realized the gravity of her situation, and she struggled to hold on to the belief that she had done the right thing. The doubt and insecurity had taken root deep within her, casting a shadow over every thought. Just when Haley thought she had exhausted all her options, Mrs. Evelyn Bennett, an elderly woman who had been a regular customer at her food stand for years, approached her with a kind smile. Mrs. Bennett had noticed Haley's struggles and offered her a small sum of money as a gesture of support. Though the amount wasn't nearly enough to solve Haley's problems, the act of kindness brought a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Bennett's eyes were filled with compassion as she handed over the money, and Haley felt a momentary relief in knowing that someone cared. However, Mrs. Bennett didn't stop there. She leaned in closer and, with a tone that suggested both wisdom and caution, proposed an idea. It was a strategy that could potentially help Haley get out of her financial predicament, but it involved taking a significant risk. Mrs. Bennett's suggestion was unorthodox, something that could either turn the tide in Haley's favor or make her situation even more precarious. As Haley listened, she felt a mixture of fear and excitement. This could be the break she needed, but it could also backfire spectacularly. With a mixture of hope and anxiety, Haley decided to take Mrs. Bennett's advice. She moved her food stand to a different part of the city, a location known for its bustling crowd during lunchtime. As she set up her stand in this unfamiliar place, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was riding on this risky decision. The new location brought in a few curious customers, and for a brief moment, it seemed like things might turn around. The hope that had been fading now flickered back to life, though Haley knew that the success was fragile and uncertain. As the day wore on, the initial rush of customers dwindled, and Haley realized that the change in location wasn't the miracle solution she had hoped for. While she made a bit more money than usual, it wasn't enough to significantly change her circumstances. The small victory felt hollow, as the reality of her situation remained largely unchanged. Haley couldn't help but wonder if she had placed too much faith in this plan, and the weight of her ongoing struggle settled back onto her shoulders. Just as Haley began to think that her new strategy might finally offer some relief, the unexpected struck. The street where she had set up her food stand was suddenly closed off by construction barriers. The once bustling area was now eerily quiet, with only the sounds of machinery breaking the silence. The flow of potential customers ceased entirely, leaving Haley standing alone, surrounded by the cold metal barriers that symbolized yet another blow to her fragile hopes. The realization that her efforts were being thwarted by forces beyond her control hit her hard, intensifying her desperation. With no other choice, Haley packed up her stand and returned to her original location. The weight of the setback was crushing. She found herself back where she started, but now with even fewer resources and more doubt than ever before. The familiar surroundings that once held promise now felt like a reminder of her struggles and failures. Every small victory she had achieved seemed to slip further away, leaving her with a growing sense of despair as she contemplated what to do next. The weight of Haley's failures began to crush her spirit. Each setback had chipped away at her resolve, but now it felt as though everything was slipping through her fingers. She sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, her head buried in her hands as the tears finally came. The emotional toll of her struggles was overwhelming, and she couldn't hold it back any longer. The fear of what lay ahead, the responsibility she carried, and the uncertainty of the future all collided in this moment, leaving her feeling utterly defeated. As the tears streamed down her face, Haley felt the full force of her despair. She had tried so hard to stay strong, to push through the obstacles, but now, it all seemed futile. The walls of her small apartment seemed to close in on her, amplifying her feelings of isolation and hopelessness. The fear of failing her family, of losing everything, was a burden too heavy to bear, and it left her feeling more vulnerable and alone than ever before. Haley stared at the dwindling amount of cash left on her kitchen table. Each dollar seemed to mock her, a reminder of how close she was to losing everything. She had tried so many different ways to make things work, but nothing seemed to be enough. Her heart pounded with anxiety as she realized that she was at the end of her rope. The fear of being evicted, of having nowhere to go, loomed large in her mind. The weight of it all pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. As Haley sat there, the thought of giving up crossed her mind. Maybe it was time to accept the inevitable and stop fighting a battle she couldn't win. The thought of admitting defeat brought tears to her eyes. She felt a deep sense of failure, not just for herself but for her family. The idea of giving up and letting the landlord evict them seemed like the only option left. The desperation was overwhelming, and the hope that had kept her going for so long was now fading away. Haley's heart sank as the elderly lady, one of her regular customers, hesitated before speaking. With a serious tone, the woman revealed that she had known Leo in the past. But the Leo she described was not the man Haley thought she knew. The lady hinted that Leo had a complicated history, one that Haley had never imagined. This revelation shook her, and doubts started to flood her mind. How could she have been so blind? The weight of this new information pressed down on her, making her question everything. As Haley tried to make sense of the information, her mind raced. She began to piece together the interactions she had with Leo, looking for signs she might have missed. The realization that she might have been deceived all along filled her with a mixture of anger and despair. Yet, despite the growing mistrust, she couldn't see a clear path forward. The puzzle pieces didn't seem to fit, and the confusion only deepened. Haley was left in a state of turmoil, unsure of what to believe or how to proceed. Haley, determined and desperate, decided to make one final push to avoid the impending eviction. She spent every last bit of energy organizing a special sale of her homemade snacks, hoping this would be the miracle she needed. But from the very start, she faced obstacles. People were skeptical, the weather turned against her, and her supplies ran low faster than expected. Yet, she pressed on, refusing to let these challenges break her spirit. As the day wore on, Haley's hope began to waver. She noticed fewer and fewer people stopping by, and those who did were hesitant to buy. The resistance she faced was overwhelming, each rejection a heavy blow to her already fragile resolve. Despite her best efforts, the day ended with far less success than she had hoped for, leaving Haley exhausted, her heart heavy with the weight of failure. Haley's once supportive friends and neighbors began to distance themselves as her struggles grew more apparent. The whispers behind her back turned into direct doubts, with people questioning her decisions and ability to recover. The loss of their confidence cut deep, leaving Haley feeling more isolated than ever before. Every conversation felt like a subtle judgment, and every glance a reminder of her failures. The weight of their doubts added to her already overwhelming burden. As the days passed, the isolation became suffocating. Haley found herself alone more often, with no one to turn to. The phone that once buzzed with messages of encouragement was now silent. The absence of support from those she once relied on left her feeling abandoned and vulnerable. Each day that passed without a friendly word or a helping hand drove her deeper into despair, making her question not just her decisions but her very worth. Haley sat quietly, her mind swirling with the weight of recent events. She began to question every decision she had made, every choice that led her to this point. The doubts crept in, gnawing at her resolve. Had she been foolish to think she could save her family from this downward spiral? Was it time to admit defeat? These thoughts crowded her mind, each one more persistent than the last, pulling her deeper into a spiral of despair. The memory of each failure replayed in her mind like a haunting film, forcing her to confront the reality of her situation. As she revisited the key moments that brought her to this crossroads, she couldn't help but feel the sting of regret. Every choice, once made with hope and determination, now seemed like a step towards inevitable failure. The moments that once filled her with pride now weighed on her like a burden too heavy to bear. Haley wondered if it was all worth it, if her efforts to protect and provide for her family had only made things worse. The internal struggle between continuing the fight or surrendering to the circumstances was a battle she never anticipated facing so intensely. Haley's mind started to piece together the small, seemingly insignificant details about Leo that she had overlooked before. These details, once dismissed, began to form a more complex picture, but it was still unclear. There was something about Leo that didn't quite add up, but she couldn't yet put her finger on it. As she reflected, certain moments stood out, lingering in her thoughts like shadows. It was as if these memories were trying to tell her something, but the message was just out of reach, leaving her feeling both intrigued and uneasy. Flashbacks of previous interactions with Leo flooded her mind. Each memory brought with it a new layer of suspicion. She remembered the way he had deflected certain questions, his nervous laughter when pressed about his past, and the subtle inconsistencies in his stories. These recollections, once brushed off as quirks, now seemed to hold a deeper significance. Yet, even as these pieces began to come together, Haley couldn't see the full picture. The truth was still shrouded in mystery, leaving her feeling both closer to understanding and more confused than ever. Haley stared at the eviction notice in her trembling hands. The words seemed to blur together as the reality of her situation sank in. This was the final notice. Her last chance had come and gone. The crushing weight of failure pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Every effort, every sacrifice she had made, now felt like it was for nothing. Desperation clawed at her as she realized there was no one left to turn to, no more time to buy. The hopelessness was overwhelming, and for the first time, even Haley, who had always found a way to keep going, felt her resolve crack. Haley sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the wall. Her thoughts were a chaotic mix of fear, regret, and exhaustion. Every choice she had made played over in her mind, each one now seeming like a misstep leading her to this inevitable end. She had fought so hard, but it all seemed pointless now. The tears she had held back for so long finally broke free, streaming down her face as the last bit of hope drained from her heart. It was the moment when even the strongest spirit faltered, and Haley felt utterly and completely alone. Haley stood by the window, her heart heavy with the weight of the eviction notice still fresh in her mind. Just as she began to feel the crushing despair close in, she heard a knock on the door. Opening it, she was taken aback by the sight of Leo. But this was not the frail man she had once known. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his posture confident, his face calm yet determined. There was a sense of authority about him now, a stark contrast to the man she had helped. Haley's mind raced as she struggled to understand what was happening. As Leo stepped inside, he began to explain. His voice was steady, revealing a truth that Haley could hardly believe. Leo was not who he had appeared to be. He had been testing those around him, searching for someone with a genuine heart, someone who would help without expecting anything in return. Haley had passed that test without hesitation. Leo revealed that he was a wealthy entrepreneur who had fallen into despair after losing his wife. He had needed to find hope again, and in helping others, he found the strength to rebuild his life. Now, he was here to repay Haley's kindness in a way she never expected. Haley listened in stunned silence as Leo offered her a lifeline. He explained that he had secured a position for her in his company, a job that would not only save her from eviction but also allow her to build a new life. He handed her a set of keys, revealing that he had also arranged a new, better home for her and her family. Tears welled up in Haley's eyes as the overwhelming realization that everything was going to change finally hit her. This was not just a solution. It was a new beginning, one born from the kindness she had shown a stranger. As Haley sat in her new living room, the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months finally began to lift. The eviction notice that once hung over her head was now just a memory. Leo's unexpected return and his generous offer had not only saved her and her family from losing their home, but had also given her a fresh start in life. The new job, the new house, everything felt like a dream. Haley looked around the room, taking in the warmth and comfort that now surrounded her. It was a stark contrast to the cold uncertainty that had plagued her for so long. Haley reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the long nights of worry, the moments when she had nearly given up, and the kindness of the strangers who had come into her life at just the right time. Most of all, she thought about how everything had changed when she decided to help Leo without expecting anything in return. That single act of kindness had set off a chain of events that led to this moment. As she looked out the window, she realized that her life had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The fear and despair that once consumed her were now replaced with hope and gratitude. Haley knew that no matter what the future held, she and her family would be okay. They had been given a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it.